All right, hi there, everyone. Welcome back to another week of ethics. This week, we are going to be turning from utilitarianism and looking at our next moral theory. I do think it'll be helpful for us to quickly just review what we've looked at so far and what kind of moral theories we've considered here in Intro to Ethics, just so that they're all on the table, and that will also help us meaningfully distinguish the moves that we make with Kant and deontology, which is this lecture subject. I just think that'll be sort of helpful for us to think about. Here, I just laid out what we've done so far since we made that transition from applied ethics to normative ethics. So remember, applied ethics was us looking at those case studies, trolley problems, sweatshops, lying as clinicians, euthanasia, and we were trying to see about what we thought was the right thing to do in certain circumstances. And then we made a turn towards normative ethics, which is this attempt to create moral theories that sort of tell us what we can do in all possible circumstances, right? And I actually hope that having those examples from applied ethics tells you a little bit about what you sort of intuitively suspect is the right thing to do, because knowing that maybe in certain cases you cared about the consequences of your actions is interesting to think about, because if you don't think in all cases you should think about the consequences of your actions, you sort of now have an opportunity to challenge yourself to think about, why did I believe that? Was I mistaken, or is there actually something else here I've not thought about before? So we turn to normative ethics, and we're trying to think now about moral theories that tell us what we should do in all possible cases. Remembering ethics is a question, what should I do? And in those applied instances, it was, what should I do right here, right now, as applied to this issue? In normative ethics, we're thinking normally, or if I could establish some norm of behavior, what is it that I should do? We decided to define moral theories with Schoeffer-Landau's definition of intrinsic value. So that is, moral theories are attempting to identify things which are intrinsically valuable. That was that causal chain. So things can be instrumentally valuable, which means they're valuable because they help you do something else that is good. My example I've given you a few times is taking this class is good because it helps you do well, and then you might get an honors degree, and then you can get a good job and you can provide for your family. And the principle there is like, you should provide for your partner and your children. Seems to be a thing that is pretty non-controversial in our society, as one of those things that is intrinsically valuable, as like a principle to which you ought to hold yourself accountable. But it's like, even if you disagree with that example, I hope you can understand that there are reasons we do things, but ultimately there's supposed to be an end of that causal chain of why, where eventually you sort of just say, because this is the thing that I am just supposed to do. This is a good thing that I am supposed to do. It is valuable because, as a matter of its own definition, that is the kind of thing to which I am ethically obligated. Intrinsically, it is valuable. And I mean, some of you have already identified this, so I don't mean to repeat myself, but if you're also a person who thinks that what makes these things valuable is because of a deity, of a god, you also can say, you can go to that causal chain, and it might be that you have to take care of your partner and your sibling, but you might go the next step and say, well, why do I have to do that? Because God has created the moral fabric of the universe to say that that is what I should do. The thing that is intrinsic value under that circumstance is like the moral law as established by God in that instance, right? And so then we've looked at four theories so far. First, we looked at egoism, and egoism is an idea that really, why I wanted to teach it to you is a lot of philosophers are thinking about it. And we obviously had the thinker we looked at for egoism, Ayn Rand. She was in the 1900s. So this is not a new theory. We just have our predominant philosopher is a much more contemporary thinker than some of the examples given in other moral theories. But a lot of people do suspect that, as a term of practicality or as a term of function, we expect most people to really only look out for their own self-interest, right? And so a lot of philosophers have thought it's this really good starting point, because egoism was the theory that said, what should I do? What is intrinsically valuable? The pursuit of one's own self-interest, right? And so a lot of philosophers think that in day-to-day life, common people, or me and you, or people who are not only thinking in the philosophical sense, we often actually expect people to be looking out for themselves. And so this egoist theory is actually sort of at the starting ground of what a lot of us intuitively suspect other people are doing, which is only looking out for themselves. When other people are nice to you, for example, or strangers, it certainly strikes me when they go out of their way to do something that I think is really polite or nice, because I do, as a function, sort of expect people to look out for themselves. And so, although it's not really a popular philosophical theory, and a lot of students don't really feel drawn to this idea that the thing that orders them in the universe is their own self pursuit, it is a good place to start out, because we have to sort of think about why, even though a lot of us only expect this of each other, why that we're not shocked when people only look out for themselves. If that is sort of the world we live in, we have to think about, well, why is it so that that is not our intuition about what truly, truly, truly orders us in the universe? And then we looked at hedonism, and the thinker we were given was Epicurus, who's an ancient Greek philosopher, first penned these ideas to paper, or at least he's the earliest example of a person we have here. But hedonism, although it seems sort of simple or brutish, it actually does strike a lot of us as an idea that you could at least imagine believing, and that one acts almost out of what pleasures them or makes them happy. And I mean, we also all sort of know people, I feel, or at least I can think of individuals I've met who really are, as a matter of action, thinking about the things that make them happy and what brings them pleasure. And that is really what guides their agency. Agency referring to their actions, right? This is sort of a phenomenon that happens in the world. So then I told you about the place we were in Europe when these ideas started to happen. And it was the case that there was this movement called the Enlightenment. And a lot of people started to walk away from the dogmatic teachings of the church. This was a time of like radical transformation in history. And it's actually when we say that the modern era began. During this time, a lot of philosophers started to think about, without the church to sort of tell people what it is that guides them, a lot of them returned to these moral theories, egoism and hedonism. Egoism becomes super important because this is actually, for example, the basis of capitalist society and liberal democracy is based on this idea that people should be free to pursue their own economic self-interest. And then also hedonism becomes very popular because a lot of people seem to intuit, once the state no longer tells you what you should do, and once the church no longer told you what to do, you were free to pursue almost brutishly your own self-interest, right? And so a lot of philosophers found that dissatisfying for reasons we talked about. And then this thinker named Bentham comes along, and he says, I like this movement away from the church. Bentham is growing up. He grows up in a period of wartime, and so he's also thinking about the ways that over hedonist thinking is starting to negatively impact society. And he says, it seems right to me that we are principally motivated by a sense of pleasure. But he wants to say that pleasure should sort of have a utility to it that grounds my actions in something larger than the action right now and here for me. So when we were thinking about hedonism, a lot of it was really a lot of this action in front of me. I'm going to ask myself, what should I do? What should I do should be whatever right now gives me more pleasure or happiness. Bentham isolated what he called utility, and I understand that this was a little convoluted, so I'm going to try and clarify it. But utility combined that hedonist idea of pleasure and happiness, and it combined it with that concept of consequentialism. Consequentialism said that we measure the utility of actions based on the consequences of those actions. So based on if we do that action, what will the consequences be? What will the ramifications be? And also thought about that amount of pleasure, that amount of happiness should not only be constituted on my own pleasure, happiness, but on the greatest number of people. The way to put that utility principle that we kept returning to was the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people. And when Bentham was writing this, he was writing the classical idea of utilitarianism, which we learned a later thinker changed it to call act utilitarianism. But that's because he encountered the question, what should I do? And he said, I have the ability to do this act. I had to ask myself, is this the act that will cause the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people? if it was the act that caused the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest amount of people, then we were supposed to do it. And this was super valuable because it actually provided an objective grounding for morality that did not rely on the state or the church, but it also allowed a diversity of things that bring people pleasure, which was, of course, the major appeal of hedonism. It actually still allowed all of those people to get what they want because Bentham was defining pleasure as just those experiences that, when experienced, were welcomed. And this was happening on the level of acts. So individual acts were expected to be held to this standard. And then Bentham's student, a guy named John Stuart Mill, who I said was deeply famous, comes along and he looks at a lot of the counter arguments we looked at for act utilitarianism, and he says, I actually think that what happiness is a little more specific. So not only are they experiences that we welcome, but they're based on those things that we desire. And of course, we know that desires can have a quantity. I can desire something more than something else. And of course, my desires could also have quality. So I might find drunkenness to be a very happy, appealing experience, or that state of having lobotomy might be a really pleasurable experience. But something like knowledge or philosophical investigation is something that brings me a deeper pleasure. And so, because I know that's a deeper pleasure, that actually is the type of pleasure that I should pursue as opposed to just doing the things that give the most amount of people a state of almost like being in a lobotomy or being drunken. Bentham gave this example where he says playing a board game is basically the same as reading a book in terms of how much pleasure you get from them. And Bentham bit the bullet, which is a philosophical way of saying accepted the unintuitive reality of that belief. But he bit the bullet and said, I actually think these things are similar. And Mill says, clearly our desires have a quality to them. And we have higher order pleasures. And when we look at that question of the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, we have to factor in how quality based, the quality of those pleasures that people would be receiving. And we should seek that we get the greatest number of high quality pleasure for the greatest number of people. And then he also looked at this issue. There was a lot of examples that act utilitarianism fought in counter arguments. Tyranny of the majority. We talked about a doctor who kills someone and uses their organs for other people. And Mill says we should think about rules that if we followed, if everyone followed these rules, would maximize the amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, instead of only thinking about actions in isolation. So when we have that example of a doctor who kills one person to save 10 bodies, if you thought about the ramifications of that decision long term, if everyone was only looking at the single act of killing a patient as a doctor and harvesting their organs for 10 other bodies, long term that will actually cause a smaller number of people to have pleasure. And so instead of thinking of actions alone in isolation, Mill makes this really interesting move, which is he says we have to think about these things as rules. So this is the context in which we're thinking. This is the context in which our next thinker, Kant, writes into. Our author of our book calls this chapter Kantian ethics. And that's actually because of, I think our author was thinking about a lot of people who are deontologists, which I will explain what that word means here in a few. A lot of people who are in this territory do not agree with Kant. As I'll explain, a lot of what Kant was doing was he was actually looking at this world. The Enlightenment's happening. People are walking away from the structures of the church and of the state. And he did, in many ways, think that that was a bad thing and tried to return the conversation back to a deontological structure. He is really eccentric as a thinker for reasons that we are going to discuss. But because what he does is he is trying to return a conversation back to where it came from, as opposed to starting a new idea in its own right, as these four theories did. I think our author is trying to pay tribute to the fact that, for example, the Catholic Church had already held for 1,800 years almost 2 millennia had the church already held to a deontological structure. So what Kant was doing was not newfangled. He just did it in a way that has become very prolific and has become deeply, deeply popular in philosophy ever since he first pinned his own ideas to paper. I will quickly, as a note, I talked a lot about the way Mill has become a really, really famous philosopher. That was the person who articulates rule utilitarianism. Mill has become a deeply influential thinker ever since he lived 200 years ago. And a student who I read as not actually a big fan of Mill, is it possible that Mill and Mill's ideas are only so popular because we're in the honeymoon phase, so to speak, of his ideas? Because John Stuart Mill only wrote down this new theory of utilitarianism 200 years ago, if that, and there just has not been enough time, like there was for hedonism, for us to get over this newfangled idea. Suggesting basically, like, is it actually going to be the case if we give it a few hundred more years, just as with hedonism, this idea is going to sort of become less and less intellectually appealing? And I actually think that that's a really fascinating observation because you are right in the sense that we've isolated Mill and we've put him against this thinker that we talk about today, Kant. And this debate between Mill and Kant has inspired the conversation of ethics the last 200 years. We in the Western philosophy have thought about these two thinkers and what they had to say, and we have investigated their ideas for the last 2 centuries. Of course, we've done other things, but if you go to a very big philosophy school, for example, and they have a scholar who is focused on one thinker, almost assuredly you're going to have a Kant specialist. I think here at Ohio State we have 2 or 3 Kant specialists. One is a graduate student, and there's 2 philosophers who full time just think about Immanuel Kant. Then you might have someone who specializes on a time period instead of one philosopher. If you have another person focused on one single person, they are probably going to think about Mill or utilitarianism generally. And that's because the student, I think, correctly identified the conversation or the honeymoon phase we're in is these 2 people lived in the 1800s, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill. Their 2 ideas fought each other, identified something really interesting about our actions. That is, the nature of our actions and the consequences of our actions sometimes contradict each other in our intuition about whether or not they are ethically justifiable. And we've spent the last 200 years thinking about those 2 ideas butting heads against each other. This is all really the context for this lecture. I think this is probably going to be on the longer side. But this is because Kant is trying to write into the world of the Enlightenment. All of these things are happening. New ideas like utilitarianism emerge. I actually don't know if Kant and Mill literally ever wrote to one another. I can't think of anything I've read about them discussing each other. I just sort of know that we, as philosophers, took both of their ideas from the same time and now ourselves pin them against each other. But Kant is writing into this sort of scheme. Of course, there are other ideas going on. This is an introductory class, and these are sort of the major theories that he's looking into. And Kant really wants to say that there is something about our duties, duty meaning moral obligation, that is true, and none of these other moral theories can sort of make sense of. That he believes a real moral theory that identifies what is intrinsically valuable would be able to explain. A few more things worth knowing about Kant. You might notice, as a bit of a note, we did not read almost any excerpts ourselves from Kant, and that is because Kant is famously a deeply difficult philosopher to read. Kant was one writing to the elite of his time. Most people during Kant's time were illiterate. They could not read. So that's the first part. But Mill thought those who could read, even if they had very little social standing, they had something to gain from the idea of utilitarianism in a way that Kant actually was quite comfortable saying, I am writing to the elite. Because those who are in power, for example, he thought, were given a God given right to be in those positions of authority. And so his writing is purposefully difficult, and he put actual intention in making it hard to read. He uses language that is super complicated and super complex and very difficult, so much so that the class you would take at a 4-year college after this, which would just be a class on ethics or moral philosophy, even when I took this class at Ohio State, which was a 3,000 level class, even at that level, we didn't read Kant. I only ever got to read Kant when I got to a 5,000 level graduate level course. And this decision Kant made to have very specific language was also because he thought what language did is it described a thing in the world which he thought were moral facts. And he was trying to use his language to describe precisely moral facts as they existed in the world. And so if you think you're describing a thing that exists in the world in the same way I might describe an animal if I was like a wildlife biologist and I was writing down this new animal I'm seeing, I'm going to write down all of the details I can because I want to get a very specific described picture of what this animal is and how it behaves, what does it look like, what are its characteristics. Just as I would write all that down as a wildlife biologist trying to observe this animal that's not been recorded in our human domain of science, Kant sees himself as doing the very same thing about morality. He's looking at these things about morality that no one else has yet penned to paper. He's trying to describe with precision what it is that he's seeing. And because of those two things, the nature of his audience and the nature of what he saw himself as doing, his writing is very, very complex and difficult to work with at the introductory level, which is fine because Kant, as I mentioned, has a huge audience of people whose full-time job is thinking about his ideas. A lot of them have created ways, like those that we saw in our reading, of being able to engage with his ideas and make them digestible at the introductory level, or at least some of his ideas. But this too has had a huge influence on the world of philosophy. And if any of you ever read philosophical papers or go on to take advanced philosophy classes or get to know a philosophy major, the whole style of philosophy, there is a major movement, which is making philosophical papers very complex, almost for the purpose of remembering the style of philosophy that Kant coined, but also because of that phenomenon I described where Kant saw himself as describing a thing in the world. This is another reason why philosophical papers get to be very complex. Returning to duty, let's think about rule utilitarianism. There was this idea that we should seek the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, right? There was a goal of our moral theory. By admitting there was a goal, that is, the goal is the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, once you say there's a goal, that means the thing you care about is not actually how you get the goal. Think of it like a game of soccer. You actually probably care very little about from where on the field the soccer player kicks the ball. All you care about is that it gets into the net. In the same way, Kant says, look, these sorts of theories which create goals for our moral behavior, by their definition, don't care about the acts themselves. They only care about the consequences. We talked about this as one of the things as a criticism that existed for utilitarianism. That is, the acts themselves, the actual actions you do not matter nearly as much as the ramifications or consequences of your actions. The only way an act under these theories, utilitarian theories, could actually matter is if something about the actual action of doing that act has some ramification or consequence. Any system that predicates a goal, any action that has some long-term purpose that they're supposed to be intended towards, will always be act neutral. They will never actually think about actions. They will only be able to focus on consequences. Just like in your soccer game. In the sport of soccer, the actual, and I don't know why I chose soccer because I actually know very little about this sport, but Where you kick the ball from is actually not very important. And I suspect your soccer coach, if you did play soccer, was ever really thinking about where you kick the ball from, unless there was a long-term consequence of always kicking the ball from the same place. Principally, the whole point of the soccer game was getting goals. That was the point.